Colleen and to Becca. But before that, as is right, we're going to do the UW-Madison land dedication. So I'll just read that out. This is something we're continuing to do, even though we're sort of online and spread out. So the University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Tejob since time immemorial. In 1832, in the 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future and collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. So that said, I'm really happy and excited to turn it over to Colleen Larson and Becca Schwartz.
Thanks a lot, Matthew. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Colleen Larson, and I am an education director at the Wisconsin Technical College System, and also a PhD candidate at UW-Madison in the Department of Educational Policy, Leadership and Policy Analysis. I'm excited for our conversation today because my research is actually focused on refugee students in two-year colleges. So I'm very excited to hear what Paul has to say to us today. I'll turn it over briefly to my co-host, Becca Schwartz, to introduce herself, and then we'll get started.
Hi, everyone. My name is Becca Schwartz. I'm the Resettlement Director at Jewish Social Services, which is currently the only resettlement agency in Dane County. I gave this talk last month to try to give people a basis for knowledge of the work that we're doing here in Madison mainly. And I'm also looking forward to hearing more from our speaker today.
Thanks, Becca. So just before we get started and I introduce Paul, I just wanted to let everyone know on the call that this is being recorded, and after the session today, you will receive an email with the recorded session and also any PowerPoint slides or things that are shared in the meeting. So just know that as we go along. And if you have questions as we have our conversation, please feel free to put them in the chat, and Becca will be monitoring and pausing. We'll be pausing throughout our time so that your questions can be asked to Paul and his team. So without further ado, I'll introduce Paul Van Auken, who's an associate professor of sociology and environmental studies at UW-Oshkosh and also chair of the Department of Sociology. Paul, I don't know if you want to say a few introductory words or introduce your other teammates before we jump into questions.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks much to everyone for inviting me. Yeah, I'd like to introduce the other folks that are here that are part of our research project team, starting with John Hobbins. Maybe you want to just say a couple words about yourself, John?
Sure. So my name's John Hobbins. I'm zooming in from Gambela, Ethiopia. That's a region of 1 million people, half of whom are refugees, 500,000 spilled over from a war zone in South Sudan. Becca, I'm teaching Hebrew, believe it or not. I'm teaching Hebrew to 58 students, which makes that the largest Hebrew class outside of Israel. Strangest thing. I'm in the newer zone, and that's one of the tribes, almost the majority tribe of South Sudan. They think they're one of the lost tribes of Israel. So it's a great experience. And back in Oshkosh, where Paul teaches, I coordinate support for students of refugee background in the Oshkosh area school district. I'm also a pastor in a Lutheran church, and we have services both in Swahili and in Arabic and Dinka, as well as English.
Thanks, John. Then we have Ken Jackson from Milwaukee. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Ken. Uh-oh, he's muted.
There we go. There, now can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. My screen that I'm looking at is so big, it's hard to find the unmute button. Anyways, yep, I'm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I'm a PhD student at UWM or UW Milwaukee. I'm in sociology department, and I, as far as the research that Paul's going to be talking about today, I was a team member and I helped lead the team here in Milwaukee with interviewing, refugees, interviewing providers. Yeah, I don't know. I hope to join in some of the discussion. I might have something to add.
And one great thing about Ken is that he's going to be teaching for us here at UW-Oshkosh next year, full-time as an instructional academic staff, which is going to be great.
Yep.
And then we have Samina Hossein. Good to see you, Samina. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul. Good to see you, Ken, and really nice to see you, Becca, as well. We spoke and we had a really good conversation. It was actually part of this project. So it's really nice to see everyone. I was in the Madison side of the project. And so I'm just here to mainly listen in and maybe chime in, but mainly to listen to Paul. And it's really nice to come together. But this project was done actually a few years ago. So a lot of us are reconnecting after a few years. So thanks for this opportunity and for this talk.
And then we have at least one more person from Oshkosh who works directly with refugees, and that's Dawn Shimura with the school district. Dawn, if you want to just briefly introduce yourself too, that would be great.
Hi, I am the ESOL program coordinator for the Oshkosh Area School District, and ESOL stands for English for Speakers of Other Languages. 25% of the 600 students, ELs that we have in our district have refugee backgrounds. So we've been working hard to support them in many different ways throughout the years that they've been here, and continue to do so as a team and as a school district, and also with the community. So nice to be here. Thank you.
And one more person I want to introduce is Tammy McLaughlin, who we did not coordinate on the front end or anything, so she's not expecting to talk, but she is here as part of the conversation. She's director of, so it's good to see that you're here, Tammy. She was an important partner in our research work and is the director of World Relief Fox Valley up here in this part of the state. I might just say, I can say a couple quick things about myself too, and then you can ask me other questions, Colleen. This is my 14th year at UW-Oshkosh. I actually made full professor, which I feel completely slighted that it still said associate professor. No, I don't. But it's a nice thing to be able to make it to that last level and not have to worry about any more of that hurdle jumping. So 14th year here. I'm a sociologist. I'm also part of the environmental studies program. I'm a native Midwesterner with a Norwegian immigrant mother who I noticed is also on the call. Hello, mother. So that's pretty awesome. One of the silver linings of this strange time we're living in, that we do more of this stuff, which can allow other people to tune in. I got my PhD in sociology from UW-Madison. And before that, worked in community development for a while after doing a master's in urban affairs and public policy out at the University of Delaware. I study things like planning and access to public spaces, concepts of place and people, land, community, local dynamics of migration flows, and teaching and learning. One last thing I'll say for the moment is that I became interested in refugee resettlement in Wisconsin after World Relief opened its office in Oshkosh in 2012, and I started to follow its work, and then became intrigued at a lot of things, including the fact that Oshkosh has received the second most refugees in the state for quite a while and is the 9th biggest city in the state. So there's clearly something interesting there, is what I thought. And of course, there are many things that are super interesting. Another thing to mention that is that I think is interesting and creates some complication and elements that are really neat too, is that both the projects that I've been involved with so far that relate to refugee resettlement were applied research projects, meaning a nonprofit entity, or in the case of the second one, an informal task force asked for the research project to be undertaken. I'll talk more about that later.
Thank you, Paul. That's a really good introduction to your background and your kind of intellectual interests and history, and then a little bit about how you became interested in researching the experiences of refugees and their resettlement in Wisconsin. So I know that your study on refugee resettlement in Wisconsin was a pretty large undertaking and involved multiple colleagues, and we see you have a team here today of student researchers and community partners. So can you tell us initially here just a little bit about the goals and the scope of the project and any significant partnerships that were involved?
Yeah, definitely. When I show some slides and talk about some of the findings and interesting elements of the process and such, I'm going to weave in elements of the first project too, so I'll just mention that briefly. The first project had to do with trying to learn more about Hmong people and their relationship to the Fox River watershed. And it was a nonprofit organization called the Fox Wisconsin Heritage Parkway that is working on creating park-like installations and a park-like thing that stretches the length of two rivers, and wanted to know more about how Hmong people interacted with the river system in order to provide programming and to start out with a basis of better understanding of how they interact with the outdoors and such. So I got connected to them based on methods, which is interesting because I hadn't really done much about refugee resettlement or anything like that yet. My dissertation work was on migration, but different sorts of migration. People moving to beautiful places and then the dynamics that causes, amenity-led migration. So this was a little different, but I got connected to them because a board member for that organization knew about a photo-based method that I like to use in my research. And so that helped open the doors to a really cool project that helped to pave the way for the second project. The latter project, which I'll refer to as Finding Their Place, which is what we called the project when we expanded it to being a statewide endeavor. It started out as something much more local and humble in its aspirations, I guess, and then it sort of snowballed from there for lots of good, and for some, I wouldn't say bad, but it became more complicated. This came about because our department, the Department of Sociology here, created a community advisory board to try to get potential partners around one table to say, hey, sociology does cool things. We have graduates that could do internships for you and that you might want to hire, et cetera. And we might be able to do things like do some research, help you answer questions and things like that. And the first suggestion was a really weighty one, but a really awesome one. And that was the person who facilitated the Oshkosh Area Resettlement Task Force saying, we could use more actual data about what happens to people after they go through the initial stages of resettlement in this area. And so we came up with a project where that was our main partner entity was the Resettlement Task Force. And that included the United Way, World Relief, the school district, including some of the people here, local workforce development agencies, county literacy organization, a number of different groups, and then a number of informal service providers, which would define John, at least in some ways at that time. He was not yet working for the school district, but I kept running into John Hobbins around town, and he was clearly very connected with residents with refugee background and doing a lot. And then eventually he came to work with the school district in his current position. So it was designed to be this project that students would carry out, community-based research, applied in nature, meaning an organization said we'd like these sorts of questions answered, and we're going to do our best to provide some useful information on that. So the goals were to build local partnerships to increase, opportunities for collaborative learning and action. That was kind of the main thing. But then more specifically regarding the research at hand is trying to answer very practical questions like, how did residents of refugee background end up in the Fox Valley? How did they fare after they resettle here? What is successful resettlement, and what factors help to predict RRBs, or residents with refugee backgrounds, achievement of that success? What services from local organizations are most important, and what gaps exist? How do these areas compare in terms of refugee resettlement experiences? So that's a question we added once we expanded the project. And then hopefully try to add to the literature on refugee resettlement in the social sciences, which is somewhat limited. So we started working on that, and some students got some really intense transformative experiences in the first stage. And we had a lot of training, which was part of that intense learning, working with people, a previous refugee liaison with the school district, having Tammy McLaughlin come into class and tell us about what World Relief does, et cetera, going through an arduous IRB process, and making sure that we had everything in place to do things with a sensitive population in as ethical a manner as possible, and that sort of thing. After we made a presentation, I and some students made a presentation to a joint resettlement task force that meets, I think, twice a year in this region. Is that right, Oshkosh folks? I think it's a twice a year thing. Yeah. After one of those presentations, somebody that works for the State Office of Refugee Services suggested that we expand the project to other areas so that we might be able to develop some comparative data. That's down the road. You're not going to hear anything about that today, because the analysis for the substantive part of our project is not yet complete. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. But we decided to take that advice. It sounded intriguing. And we applied for a grant from WISIS and their Applied Research Grant Program. And WISIS is generally funding technology-oriented projects through as an arm, or at least it was started by the university. It's connected to the university system. But they have this applied research project for which social scientists are eligible to apply. And so we wanted to, our grant application basically said we want to expand what we're doing to try to gather more information about how to help residents with refugee background be more successful in the workforce and such, which would benefit Wisconsin communities, et cetera. And we got that grant, and that meant that we expanded the project majorly. And it meant that we could hire Ken to help manage the Milwaukee part of it, and hire Samina to help manage the Madison part of it. And Samina had a bunch of students from UW-Madison working under her as part of that. Ken worked closely alongside my colleague, Orly Hauser, who sadly has left and gone to Yeshiva University out in New York City now. But in the end, this project has involved 5 professors working a number of hours on it, 40 plus undergrad and grad student researchers, a number of translators, and many community partners who served as connectors across the 4 study sites. We actually had a 4th site, which we're not going to talk about today, but that's Samina's site out in Seattle, because she was going to be spending time in Seattle. And so we added that to the project. So that'll be part of the comparative data that we have in the end too. Today, we're going to focus on the Wisconsin work. The other thing we did was produce a traveling exhibit, which I'm going to show you some pictures of here in a little bit, pictures from. Yeah, so it became a large, very different project from where it started, and exciting, complicated, a little bit messy, a little bit awesome, all those things probably.
Wow, thanks, Paul. Yeah, it sounds like a really multifaceted but really important project that would be incredibly useful to the community, as the question came from the community. You kind of alluded at some, going through the IRB process or some other things that might have been challenging along the way, especially with this particular population. But would you be willing to tell us a little bit more about some of the challenges that you faced in trying to, conduct this particular research, and then how you went about resolving those challenges?
Yeah, and I'm going to come back to some more details on this, because this is the main subject of one of the papers that we've gotten published so far, which is mostly about the process of doing a project like this. But there are a number of interesting challenges. The language barriers that was a common challenge for both the Hmong Voices project and the Finding Their Place project. With the Hmong Voices project, that was overcome, not completely, but hiring two Hmong research assistants that could speak the Hmong language and had connections was critical to that project succeeding. If we weren't able to do that, and we didn't have the benefit of having a healthy population of Hmong students here at UWO, that project wouldn't have been successful. With the Finding Their Place project, I think probably the biggest challenge would be trying to coordinate the work of a number of people at different sites. Would you agree, especially Ken and Samina, given that you're intimately involved with that? That's one big challenge, and I think the project was successful overall, and we managed to coordinate, but a number of the frustrations and things that were a little hard to get through stem from just being in different places, and then each having people working with us in these locations. So we had people that we were managing, students and such. So coordinating across sites is very difficult. Working with community partners was complex and very interesting. And we learned a number of lessons, and that's part of what we stress in the paper too. Things that we should have done a little better, and things that maybe service providers would benefit from hearing the researcher's perspective on this sort of thing, because it really entails building a relationship that involves mutual trust, and that doesn't happen overnight. So I see we have Malawal here too. Welcome, Malawal. I'm going to ask you to say a few words about yourself in a little bit if you're comfortable with that, but I'll let you know. So now I forget where it was exactly, but yeah, that doesn't happen overnight to build those relationships. That's for sure. And part of the complicating, the fact that we got this grant, as anybody that's gotten a grant knows, it's a double-edged sword. In that, prior to this, we could pretty much carry on this humble project and do the best we could to produce some data. It's good to get pushed to try to take it to a higher level, and a grant will help you do that. But then with that grant comes strings that can complicate things. Like, it's very difficult to spend your own money in a bureaucracy like a UW system school. It's a huge headache. So it's a great thing to be able to hire people. It's not great when you can't get them paid. And so Ken had some experiences with the person that was working with him to translate into, I can't remember if it was Karen or is a different language for the spoken by Burmese people. And it was so challenging because she was expecting to be paid right away, and we couldn't just pay her right away. And that caused a whole sort of cascading set of difficulties. It led to, this whole challenge of trying to, overcome the language barriers connected us to people too, though. So a lot of these things that are really challenging produce these interesting opportunities too, to connect us to new people and create new relationships and such. So those are a few of the challenges that come to mind. I don't know if anybody wants to add anything in particular right now about that. Anybody from the team? Otherwise, we'll come back to it, and you can do so at that point. I guess just in case we don't get to it, one of the things that's interesting about undertaking a project like this is if you have researchers and then a community partner, and at Madison you have somebody that studied this a lot in the sociology department, Randy Stoker, and we utilized some of his work for the process paper that we wrote. But he gets into this, the complicating factors of this. A lot of these things sound great on paper, and they are great in intention, but they're hard to carry out in a way that both sides are satisfied. So on the one hand, you might have organizations feeling like, in a way, they're kind of being used by a university entity that's just looking for something to send their students to go do, or to, you know, kind of a classic research or subject problem where are you just there to extract information and what are we going to get back from this? But on the other hand, if it's a partnership, then the organization has to have to buy into it, and then be able to, in a situation like this, make connections to potential respondents, because it can be a difficult group of people to reach, especially if language barriers or cultural barriers make them less likely to be interested in talking to, you know, some white professors or students, for example, or whatever the case might be. So one of the really interesting tensions there is that if we would have had, one of the things that was really hard to do was recruit respondents. And on the one hand, this was totally understandable that certain key partners it wasn't that comfortable for them to do that, because there's this crossing of lines that gets tricky. But on the other hand, we had to really work around and try to find other avenues to get connected to people, which takes time and is challenging. But you know, from the research perspective, there has to be some distance between the group that's providing services and research if it's actually going to be good, valid research. Otherwise, people might feel like they're being coerced, or this problem that you'll find in any social research, social desirability bias, will be heightened even more, where people are going to say what they think you want them to say. So there are a lot of things like that we discussed in our first paper that are really interesting, that there were things we had to work through.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I'm finding in my own research that a lot of those things are very true for me too. A lot of challenges, specifically what you mentioned about, you know, delicate partnerships and relationships, and not only with other organizations and agencies, but also with the participants themselves and with communities themselves. So I really appreciate that. I think this would be a good time to turn to Becca and see if we have any questions that have come in from the chat, and then we'll jump back in and talk a little bit more about some of your findings so far.
Samina thankfully answered the question that had come up. Thank you for doing that, Samina. And I believe that the attendees can all check out the Q&A. If that's not the case, just chat and I can read out the question and the answer. And please be sure to include any questions that you have in the chat or in the Q&A section. We're monitoring both right now.
It looked like John might have been raising his hand just a minute ago too. John, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, I'll say something about, so what you were saying, Paul, about the delicate balance between, you know, if you're a service provider and then you're a researcher and then you're a potential respondent. I think another aspect of that is also because of the photography. Because being photographed is a sensitive issue. There's also cultural aspects to it. And I'll give an example. It's not this particular project, but those from Oshkosh probably are aware of the Humans of Oshkosh site that's spearheaded by a colleague of yours, Paul, Grace Lim. And imagine trying to do something like that. That's where you're establishing a relationship with people really on the fly, right? And then you are asking them all sorts of personal questions, and then they're getting their picture. Culturally speaking, I remember I was asked by her to recruit people for Pacific demographics to include in the Humans of Oshkosh. And sometimes what would happen is that maybe I had a relationship, you know, a strong relationship with a particular family. I'm thinking now of a homeless family, a Somali family. So a mother with, I don't know, 6 or 7 kids in a homeless shelter. And she trusted me because over the course of, I don't know how many times, we just had that kind of relationship. And then I thought, oh, this would be a good example. This would be the kind of thing that the researcher from UW-Oshkosh would love to include in her project. But the chemistry just did not work out. When they met, it was like, whoa, sparks and like confrontation, and I'm not getting my picture taken because that's not my culture, which was true, and at the same time, not necessarily true. You know, there's often like different shades for how that works. So it was not a predictable situation. And I think that's true a lot in this kind of research, especially when you add pictures or you're talking about personal things. Sometimes, you know, the openness that people have is extraordinary, and maybe even more than they should, if that makes any sense. And then on the other hand, there'll be other people who will provide data of a particular kind, but that can't be publicized in the same way, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and I'm going to show some photographs that photography is part of the process here, and it's something we had to think really carefully about. It also brings up another complication, and that is that sometimes if you're doing a project like this, it can be confused with other projects. And this again is, you know, ties back to being really clear in communications, building relationships so people definitely understand who's who. Because we had a couple situations where in one case, there was a picture taken for a local publication where the people didn't understand that they were getting this picture was going to be in the newspaper or anything like that. And it was caused a real traumatic situation for the family. It had nothing to do with our project, but that's not necessarily clear to other people who might want to be participants in the project. They might have seen that and say, well, this must be something to do with that. So we don't want to do that sort of thing. And we had another case where a person was criticizing our project at a public meeting of this task force. And I don't think they were talking about our project, but they thought they were. What they were referring to something else. And so that kind of helped cause some, I don't know, possibly cause some distrust and things like that. So that can't be stressed enough that really it's about, like with any of these endeavors, it's about building relationships, but that takes time. So sometimes the results can, if you're really trying to, you know, you have a deadline, for example, with a grant, and that particular grant was short in its duration, only 1 year, short time to try to do a serious project like this. These things take time, and you might be then feeling that pressure. Well, we're not getting people in, and that we were feeling that pressure because it was hard to get respondents. In the end, we have a lot of data to work with, but that was a big challenge for sure.
We have a couple questions in the Q&A section. Danvas has asked, what are some of the issues that came out of your research that you did not think about before interviewing the participants? Was confidentiality an issue?
Well, like I said earlier, this had to go through extensive assessment by the Institutional Review Board at our university. So confidentiality is the key cornerstone of doing this kind of research. So we're covering inherently sensitive topics of all kinds. So we did a number of things that were basically came out of negotiating with our IRB, such as doing some things that are not usually necessary, such as having a pre-participation form filled out. So we would always do an informed consent form that we go through with people that explains to them why we're doing what we're doing, what the benefits should be, what the potential risks are, and making sure that they agree with all the ways we're planning to use the information, and stressing that everything they say is going to be kept confidential. But prior to that, we sent a letter that explained the project, and then I had a one-page form that basically where people had a chance to say, yes, I would like to participate, or no, I wouldn't. Well, first, I consider myself a resident with refugee background, and we didn't put any parameters on that. Do you consider yourself in that category or not? Yes. Okay, great. And then do you need things like a researcher of a certain gender? And do you need language translation or interpretation, that sort of thing. So we had a process that took those sorts of things very seriously. There were all kinds of things that came up that we wouldn't have expected. I think one of the really positive ones that just pops out at me from the process of writing the first paper that we all did together was from Milwaukee, and the idea that that Ken and Orly helped make a food-related event work and help to develop trust with the participants that they ended up then being able to build some relationship with afterwards and have some successful research meetings. Just saying, I think you said we'll go run and get utensils at the store or whatever, because it was like a logistical problem with this big gathering. But that sort of helped unlock the door to connecting with some folks that they could then do surveys and interviews with. So that's just one example.
Can I add something?
Sure.
Another thing about with the confidentiality question, it was also a big concern because we're interviewing the RRBs, and we also wanted to make sure that they understood that it was confidential and their confidentiality would be protected from the providers that are providing them with the things they need, I'm pretty certain that a number of RRBs simply didn't even participate because they were concerned that if they spoke out not as favorably about the providers, that maybe that would affect them. So we had to emphasize that in the consent forms and stuff too.
Yeah, and that's basically putting a finer point on what I was saying earlier about this balancing act of having enough connection with the entities that are providing the services, but having also enough distance. But there are other complicating factors, like oftentimes people would want to be interviewed in the company of relatives and friends. And that was a tricky thing to figure out. What do we do about this situation? We need to be able to have a private space, and that was not necessarily something that people necessarily wanted to do. So there are a lot of interesting things that happen like that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think you've brought up already quite a few good considerations for doing this type of research. I'm just taking a look at the time and want to make sure that we have a robust amount of time for you to be able to talk about some findings. So I know you're still in the process of analyzing and kind of disseminating your research, but if you would you be willing to highlight some of the important things that you've learned so far about refugees in our community and the process of resettlement?
Yeah, definitely. I'll pull up a PowerPoint that's got 1 million slides in it, but this presentation will be shared along with the recording with people that want to see it. So if you want to look into the details further, they'll be there for you. I'm just going to scroll through and show some of the photos that relate to the exhibits, that relate to the people like Malawal who had their portraits taken, and things like that, and talk about some of the take-home messages, I guess, that we have already written about, or can pull from what we know from our research so far. So I'm going to try to share my screen successfully here. All right. Okay, now how did I do that before, where I'm just showing why does that not come up? Slideshow, there we go. Okay, and right off the bat, you can see some of the pictures taken by us and taken by participants in the project, and I'll highlight a few of them as we go forward here. I'm not going to talk much about the literature. I don't think that's necessary at this point, but if you read the paper, which you'll find a link to in this PowerPoint, you'll see that we place it within this terrain of community-based research, or community engaged is another term for it. It's also, you know, part of the initial thrust was community-based learning. And here's where you see a couple quotes from Randy Stoker about how this can be a tricky thing to achieve in a way that pleases everyone. And then some of the background, the niche that we're trying to fill in some ways on the literature about refugee resettlement. One of the first things is that part of what we're doing in this project is not only surveying and interviewing residents with the refugee background, but we also did a lot of interviews with service providers too. And that's going to be the subject. That's the subject of one of the next papers we're working on, right, Ken? You're spearheading this, I think. We're expecting great things soon. No, I'm joking. We're collaborating on that, but that's one of our next papers. So some more details about what we actually have done for this project. We developed a survey, and that survey, the process to develop it fits really well with the idea of community-based research, in that we worked directly with members of the Oshkosh Area Resettlement Task Force to develop the survey. It's the same survey we used in Madison, Milwaukee. So you could ask, well, maybe that survey wasn't necessarily a great fit for those other sites. And that may be true, but it's a pretty general survey looking for really basic things. It's long though. And that's one of the things I would say too, that sometimes in doing applied research like this, the process was great. I mean, we had multiple meetings. The Resettlement Task Force came up with basic themes and questions, and then we worked together in a workshop to hear more about that and to fine tune them. But in some cases, the results made things even more complicated. Like it ended up being a long survey, which was problematic, especially given the language concerns, the language barriers that we had. Most of those surveys were done in person with, you know, researchers reading through and taking notes about the answers. And we did have translated versions of some of this work for certain languages anyway. We did a number of interviews with RRBs about their identity, resettlement stories, outlooks for the future. We did photo elicitation-based interviews with some of them. And we ended up with having quite a few people involved, both on the RRB side and then the service provider side. A lot of data to work through. And so we're still working through it. And then we produced an exhibit, which I'll show you some examples of what was in that exhibit here in a minute. So some of the challenges, I think I've talked about this already, but so I'm not going to go into great detail about a lot of this. In addition to translators, we worked with people who were there to make connections for us. You know, John Hobbins is a good example of a person that was a connector. In Milwaukee, there were a couple people that weren't necessarily formal service providers that were really important connectors. And Samina can talk. She may want to add more about how she was able to get. I think she worked some of her students, as I recall, ended up being important connectors because of their own experiences as RRBs themselves and such. So we had forms translated into languages like the ones listed there. Sensitivity, I think I already talked about that. Coordination, yep. Talked about all those challenges. Here's just an example. This is the pre-participation form that I was telling you about. And then the one that's translated into Arabic on the right, just to give you an idea of what we used. And we're perfectly happy to share anything. If anybody would find this useful to things for things you're working on, just let me know. We're happy to share. Some of the original research team here in Oshkosh, we had meetings in Milwaukee and Madison and Oshkosh with our various crews of people. The one on the bottom there is from Madison. The one at the top was a research team meeting combined with a really cool endeavor that John helped to organize with the Oshkosh Area School District, with Don and others, Write Your Life workshop with Ibtisam Barakat, an author that was pretty powerful for the students and for Oshkosh. There were a number of different events that are involved with that that were about empowering people, helping to develop their own voices and such. This is the main exhibit that I've been mentioning. Some of the photos featured in the poster on the left, and then people at the opening night for the exhibit at an art gallery here on campus. Maybe just play a few seconds of this. This was at the opening night gallery event. The person who took the portraits, named Colin Crowley, is playing guitar. He lived in Kenya for 10 years and married a Kenyan, and then moved back to Wisconsin, where he's from. And so he learned to play guitar and picked up rhythms and such. And then Christopher here is one of our, a well-known resident with refugee background in the Fox Valley, who is a singer. And so they improvised some music as part of that event. I don't know if you can hear that through the Zoom call, but so just to give you a little taste of that, you can see a couple minutes of that later if you'd like, after you get the PowerPoint. But one of the really cool parts about this is just, you know, being able to share, not just that residents with refugee background are resilient, but they're interesting, creative people that have a lot to offer. And that's the side of their stories that the general public often doesn't get to see. And that's part of the point with doing this exhibit, is to be able to help share some of their stories and for people to understand them better. This was another exhibit at the Holiday Folk Festival International in Milwaukee, in partnership with the International Institute of Wisconsin. And so our exhibit was intermingled with other things that group put together. This was these were people from the Rohingya Community Center in Milwaukee that helped staff that exhibit. People commented and shared their own stories based on looking at the images, which is pretty cool. And then this was from St. Norbert's, a conference on refugee resettlement that happened in spring of 2019. And what's really neat is that this person is Maisi Tao, who I did not know then, but I know her now because she's the new Hmong Studies Director at UW-Oshkosh. I just was looking at these pictures preparing for the presentation and said, I think that's my seat. And it turns out I was correct. And she's coming to my class next week to talk about related issues. She's a medical anthropologist that studies medical issues that have come about from the resettlement process, like diabetes being a major problem within Hmong communities. Okay, I'm not going to go through this whole framework here, but if you do look at it later on your own, you'll see that it's organized based on this 4-part emplacement framework, which is the foundation of the piece that we published from the Hmong Voices project. And so if you are in the PowerPoint later, you can just click that link and read the paper. This is dated information, but there hasn't been a whole lot of refugee resettlement. I'm sure you're aware of that in the last 4 years. But it's a good time to be having a conversation like this, isn't it? Because that's probably going to change in the near future. And there'll be much more of this coordination and discussion that needs to happen. These are some pictures from our exhibit showing some of the situations that people were leaving as they were resettled to places like Wisconsin. Refugee camp in the Congo and in Syria, in Somalia, Rohingya in Bangladesh. So these were taken by Colin Crowley or with permission from some of his photographer friends. And then we had some materials that were shared by RRB participants in our project who gave us permission to share them as such, about the actual process of being displaced and being resettled. So displacement in this framework is about who or what has been uprooted. And here's some details on that. This was, again, in 2017 alone. There were 68.5 million newly displaced people. Unfortunately, that was a new record. It was setting a new record every year. We had participants from all of these places in our project. And then we have a number of interesting quotes about the displacement. So a couple bolded lines are from an Iraqi RRB. I always felt like I was going to lose my kids, whether it was because of a bombing or because of a gunshot. Another Afghani man said the best time of my life was when I got the email saying I was approved, because if I didn't get out of there, they would have killed me. Some pretty dramatic stuff that people shared with us that, disseminating this information should cause people that have other, negative, pejorative outlooks on RRBs to question those. That's for sure. This is a picture that we took as directed by our RRB respondent about where the category of where you're from. So she put on her traditional clothes and said we could take a picture and share it in this fashion. Okay, so some of the key things that we found was that what was misplaced, what has been lost, what's misaligned is that skills and work ethic are not aligning well. So we had Iraqi lawyer, for example, who got a graduate degree in Wisconsin, still only able to find translating work. Sudanese mom who, despite doing all our research with us in good English, was ashamed by her English and said she couldn't find the time to get better at it and was focused on getting her kids through college, which she did at UW-Oshkosh, which is pretty awesome. Bosnian sales director, going from that to being at square one once they got to the US. And this was that person saying, I never would have come to the US. I had a good job, everything I needed. And lots of people saying, I need to be working, I need to have better work. And I want to get at least to Malawal here because he's with us in this conversation. He was one of the people that were highlighted via these portraits and brief snippets of their story. So Malawal, I don't know if you want to share a little bit about your story in terms of after you came to Oshkosh and anything that happened from then until the point now where you're also working for the Oshkosh Area School District. It'd be great if you feel like sharing anything from your experience with us.
I think I will share only two basic things about my personal journey. Just briefly from Sudan to, of course, the United States, and of course from Chicago to Oshkosh. Anything related to school district, I think I would allow that one for Sean, for Diane and John. Basically, I'm originally from Old Sudan, and now I'm from New Southern Sudan. As you outlined, sorry.
He's working at the school.
Yeah. So just give me a second. So it is a tough journey, but this is the way I put it in the simplest term. When you have 1 million people are displaced, and you're going to have almost about 4,000 or 3,000 Southern Sudanese ending up in the United States, you are among the lucky people. So the dream is not an idea that whatever you have lost in your country, you should come overnight to compensate itself. The classical example I can tell you, because usually when I go home from work, I see the highlight, what's going on. And I have watched a confirmation of Attorney General and his background. What he said yesterday was that if his parent didn't bring him here, he would have not even been considered to be Attorney General of the United States. For some of us who have those perspectives, whatever you live in your country, you cannot get it again. However, when you have that second chance, you can rebuild your life gradually. And some of us who have children now, we are hoping maybe their life is going to be better. Like the person we think now, the people that are considered to confirm him to be Attorney General of the United States. So the refugees in the general is a hard journey. And the system in the United States is so complex that even Americans who are born here, sometimes they have a hard time. However, if the children find a sweet place, like a small place in Wisconsin, sometimes that's how things turn around. So in my personal experience, when I came here, the first thing I fell in love with was that the schools are too small, the class size are too small, city is very small. I've been a refugee for almost half of my life before I came to the United States. So finding a sweet place for my children is what made me happy, even I didn't have anything. However, when I got people like Father John and they show me what to do, that's why now I consider Wisconsin to be my second home. So I would not love to take a lot of time. I would leave a chance, for other participants, if anybody would have a question, I would be more than willing to talk about it. But just to conclude it, when you were talking about the next year, because after 4 years, it's not, we're going not to talk about it about political content, but I think this year, the number of allocation of the refugees who are going to come to the United States, the number is going to increase. The question is how they're going to do allocation. People who will come from Asia and Africa. From my experience, sometimes you will say, okay, 50,000 refugees are come from Africa, but you have to divide it into hard spot. I can say an example from now is the Democratic Republic of Congo is leading. So if there is a number going to be allocated to African continent, they will look, for example, at Congo, Ethiopia now with the situation going on. That's how they will do allocation. That is how the resettlement process works. It's complex, but people who make it to come here, sometimes they will say America is no good. But for me, I just put it bluntly, America is damn good. Thank you.
Thanks, Malawal. And yeah, there's obviously a ton more to talk about, but hopefully we're able to share a few useful things from our project. Okay. And we can hang around and
sure. Yeah.
More questions too.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to be sensitive to time. We only have 1 minute left in the scheduled time, but I think you've shared a lot of really valuable information about the way you set up the study and the things that you've learned so far. We do have a few other questions I know that have come in from the chat, and folks might want to stick around and just be able to continue the discussion. I'll pass it over back to Matt to just kind of close us off officially, but then we can feel free to stay and keep chatting for a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great plan, Colleen. Let's all, people who are able to, let's stick around and get some questions answered. And if possible, talk about how these findings can inform ways to think about to support refugee success in our communities. Let me just say for everyone who's here, thank you for attending. Paul, thank you very much for sharing your research and having your team here with us. I want to say that it's this last Tuesday of the month is when we're continuing to have our webinar series. Our next one is going to be March 30th at 3 o'clock. And that's with Professor Sarah Dryden-Peterson from the Harvard Graduate School. Her work, she's sort of a well-known scholar, having made major contributions to the research on refugee education. She just published recently a piece on civic education, but then she's also coming out with a book of her research. So that's their next one. Following that, Corinne Brown, who's executive director of One Earth International Credential Evaluations, which is right here in Madison. She's going to be addressing this issue of the recognition of educational credentials and professional credentials. And Paul, that's something that you brought up. Some of the interviews that you read talked about that problem. And so we're going to dive deep into that problem with Corinne. Really looking forward to that. That's April 27th. And then last on May 25th, it's last in our series, is going to be a panel discussion with college students with refugee background. So that's going to be May 25th at 3 o'clock. I'll also just mention to everyone, if you have a particular interest in community-based research, I have another webinar series that I'm doing with my colleague Bailey Smolarek, and so when you go and register for these webinars, you might also see another webinar series there on community-based research. Just wanted to mention those opportunities, and to thank everyone for participating. And so can we we could stop the recording then?
Well, there are a couple of questions that I wanted to do in the Q&A that we can keep the recording on for, I think.
Good idea. Okay.
So this one, I'll go to the one for Malawal first. Danvas is saying that they did their study in the Sudanese Lost Boys. And the people that they interviewed went through Kenya and Egypt. What made you consider going to Liberia?
Oh, you're muted. You're still muted.
Yeah, can everybody hear me now? Okay. So because Sudan was, neighboring 8 countries, and when the civil war broke out, the people, they don't go in only one country. So to answer your question specifically about myself, it was in 1986 when I graduated from high school, and I was a basketball player. So I was very fortunate. And by that time, that was the high peak of the war. So most of the people who left to walk to Ethiopia or Kenya, most of them, they left 85, 86, and then 87. It was very hard, even for you to venture to walk, because it's something that would take you like about sometime 2 months, 3 months. But because I was a basketball player and I was in a capital city, it was difficult for me to venture to say I'm going to another border country, because you have to take a bus. Maybe it would take you about 4 days. And perhaps you might be caught. And they say, oh, you're from Southern Sudan, and then you are targeted. Luckily enough, because having that connection and being a basketball player, I had an opportunity to obtain a passport. And then I had a friend of mine who went to Liberia in early 70s. So I told them, I'm getting a visa to go to Liberia. So I went to Liberia and I requested political asylum. For the lost boy specifically, that was actually in 86 and 87, where the villages, they were burned down. So the journey to lost boy is starting from 10 to 50 to 100 to 1,000 until forming 10,000. And when they reach to Ethiopia, maybe 3,000 and 5,000 lost their life. So the unique situation between myself and the lost boy is that at least I was over 18 years old when I left. Lost boy, majority of them, they were either 7 years, 8 years, and 9 years. So they have to work in a group. So I was fortunate to fly out from Khartoum to Liberia. Sometime that where the thing turned around. I went to Liberia in 87. Unfortunately, there was a civil war in 1919 in Liberia. So I have to walk, something that I didn't do in my home civil war. Have to take a boat to go to Ghana. And I spent 4 years in a refugee camp before I could come to the United States. So yes, these are the way I categorize it. Lost boy, they were lost boy. Malwa now tend to be a lost man. So that is the way, I make a distinction. So they were too young, but at least I was 18 years old by the time I left my country. But I flew from Khartoum to the Republic of Liberia.
Thank you for that. And the last question that was written is from Lisa. Is there one or more follow-up projects to come from this work? What would you pursue if budget were no object? And I'll pose that to Paul.
Yeah.
Well, there's more papers to come.
Could I excuse myself because my wife is going to go to work, and I hope next time, I will come to the meeting early. So sorry, but thank you for inviting me.
Coming, Malawa.
Next time. Okay. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Yeah, with a lot of these things, at least from my experience, the next thing is we need to just get our analysis done and get a couple different papers out from this project, and then after that we'll have to see. One of the things that I'm working on here at Oshkosh, but is something we hope will have a broader reach, is a new entity called Wisconsin Institute on Social Equity, and I'm hopeful that down the road we can have a refugee studies arm of that, where we get people together that are working, because we have multiple other people on our campus who weren't necessarily involved with this project, but have expertise in this area. And that's just our little campus. So there are clearly people throughout the state, and they may have their own things like that already going on, but we'd like to build up a group of people that want to keep working on this stuff and coordinating. So that's one thing. I don't know. I'd like to hear from some of the people, partners that are on the call from Oshkosh and from the team with the second question, because I guess if money were no object and we didn't have time constraints, I would just focus on building relationships and doing things differently in a lot of different ways. And that's part of what that paper is about. And I hope you'll read it. I'll stick a link in the chat here when I'm done saying this, but I think, that's the stuff that takes so much time and energy, but it's the stuff that's so important and really crucial to having good outcomes. So that's what I would say. But people that are, on the educational side of this, what would you want to see? Or fellow researchers, what's your take on that? Good question. So how about this? I'm going to put you on the spot, Samina. What would you say, based on your research, specifically in terms of higher education? If you could, had a magic wand, what are some of those barriers that you uncovered through your research in the project for RRB success in college?
So yeah, I think, so actually Matthew Wolfgram and Becca Schwartz would also be good, I think, spokespersons on this, because some of my comments is drawn from a panel talk where both of you were present. And it was a UW-Madison based talk by, I'm forgetting the exact title of but they look into education, WSCAP. Yeah, and some of the comments I recall there, and we'll hear probably about this in later other webinar series in this other episodes, but in terms of higher education, there's a desire I felt among students of refugee background. They want to reconnect. They want to be both rooted in US, but also reconnect with their heritage. So some kind of course offerings, some kind of avenues for them to be able to do that, some kind of recognition of their heritage. So some of the Hmong courses that are offered at UW-Madison are actually the product of Hmong student activists. They got together, they mobilized themselves and demanded that there be more coursework. And some of these students of refugee background actually know, sadly, not too much about their own background. It's not always communicated to them. Sometimes parents will be hesitant to speak so much about the war or about, sometimes it's traumatic. Some of them are learning about their cultures for the first time in the university. That's something I learned. But then there's also, there are also issues about how their culture is being represented at the university, what kind of textbooks or how their cultures are being represented. Especially there's concern that I've heard some of them feel that they're not always put in the best of light. Their cultures are not always. So maybe that kind of sensitivity, more courses that can help them to reconnect with their heritage, but also paying attention to how their cultures are being represented in those courses. And really, it seems like one of the keys there is maybe to hire more people of their background who are probably best positioned to deliver that kind of, so that I would say. And also, I don't want to get too much into the other material, which Matt, I think will be covered, but the graduation requirements, all these kind of bureaucratic delays that get in the way. For example, also age limits. I recall from that talk, for example, in order to enroll, sometimes people, so there's all kinds of delays that happen in the course of a refugee's journey from their homeland to the US. So they can't always be their high school or school education was disrupted along the way. So they might pass the age limit that qualifies them for a free public education. And so they have to actually pay to get a GED, whereas others are getting a high school education for free. But anyway, I'm going to actually defer that material to Matthew and Becca. That's not my, I would say, but that's one of the observations is I would say the ethnic courses have been a lot of students of refugee background have really appreciated that.
I just wanted to say thank you for that comment. That my group of, I have a group of students that I work with, Hmong American students, and they're the ones who are really advocating for that, Hmong studies. I think one thing that they've really focused on is that the need for kind of critical frameworks, so feminist frameworks, other critical frameworks when teaching courses, ethnic studies courses, because if an ethnic studies course sort of reproduces kind of, for example, patriarchal kind of values, that can be harmful. But if an ethnic studies course communicates a sense of cultural wealth, but also critical perspectives on their experience or the way in which refugees are represented in the university or in our communities, they're really advocating for that. So they're doing sort of like kind of both. Like we'd like much more of these programs and coursework because they really benefit students with refugee background, especially at a predominantly white institution. But it needs to incorporate critical perspectives. Like actually, if it doesn't, it can be harmful, and we have evidence for that as well. But thank you and I'll put, my students did a paper on this, and I'll put it in the chat. I'll go find it right now. But thank you and I'll tell my students about your comments, which were really beautiful. Thank you.
I might just add one quick thing. From one of the preliminary findings from our study that relates to this is that a significant portion of the people who did not have a high school degree or higher before they came to the US have not been able to add, to their educational attainment since being here. And so Samina is getting at some of the reasons why that could be the case. The good news is that most of those people have, though, that there have been things that have been working well, given the focus of, in the Oshkosh area, people like John and Dawn and people like you folks from Madison that are focused on these kind of issues. There seem to be pathways to success, but some people are falling through the cracks, and our data definitely shows that. And that's particularly problematic because we know from education research and from the sociology of education that parents' educational attainment is such a key predictor of success for their offspring. So, if their parents aren't having a good situation in terms of getting their own education, that may, and we'll keep working on this obviously in our analysis because our data should help us to be able to see some of that too. That may impact the success of their kids too. Just wanted to add that.
It seems like the community colleges provide kind of a pathway, and we have partners at Madison College who are part of our group planning this webinar. Colleen, I don't know if I think your research actually focuses on this. I don't know if there's anything you can say about the kind of community college pathway for supporting students with refugee background.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, because I was just thinking of GED, HSED, that whole conversation, and also credential evaluation. Credit for prior learning is something that the technical colleges are focused on. Dual enrollment is another thing that they're focused on. So folks who might be in high school being able to get college credit for free while they're still in school. I think all of these avenues are not understood. The pathways are not maybe as clear as they could be, specifically in this community, so that folks understand the opportunities. And like you said, Paul, the relationships, it's really important that the colleges in the local area have the relationships, not only with resettlement agencies, but also with communities themselves, so that something like, hey, I just heard of someone who has a lot of welding experience, and there's no reason that person shouldn't be able to come here and be able to get that welding experience recognized, and then have it evaluated in some sort of efficient way so that they can get a credential that's valuable in the workforce. But it seems that even though those systems are in place, the disconnect is the relationship building sometimes. Some colleges do, and local communities have really strong connections, and you can see it working well in those areas. And I think in other places, we still have work to do. So the infrastructure seems as though it's there. It's the connecting from my experience so far that seems like most necessary.
That's one pet idea that I don't, and this is good that you mentioned that, because it sounds like there's not necessarily something like this in Madison. I don't believe there's anything quite like this in the Fox Valley either, which is to have a more formal partnership arrangement between employers and educational entities and service providers. That, because I know about this model happening in other situations, not necessarily focused on people with refugee background, but people that are not having success in the workforce. And basically they get into a program that provides them with, they're on the clock from the beginning, and they're provided with training, and they're being socialized into that work environment. And then they have jobs waiting for them at partner employers. That's taking it to another level. Maybe there are models like that in Wisconsin. If there are, I'd like to hear about them.
Well, I think of apprenticeship often, right? Apprenticeship is a huge opportunity, right? For someone to know that they have a job waiting for them at the end of their study, and then to have some financial help being able to get through their program and to be working along the way and seeing how those skills are directly applied to their job. That's a huge motivator. And I think students in apprenticeship are very successful typically because of all of that support. Yeah. But when we look at, and there's a lot of effort going on to diversify apprenticeship, but historically we see that the students that go into apprenticeship are not always those that may really benefit from those supports the most. So I think that's a question, is how do we make sure that on the employer side, when you need to get the job first, in order to activate the apprenticeship and have the training come along with it, how is the relationships and partnerships in that space working so that communities like folks with refugee backgrounds can have access to those opportunities from the workforce side?
I'll just jump in too from our perspective. I think I just keep coming back to this very, very basic challenge that we face in resettling refugees when they're mainly when they're very new, is how do we get the information to be retained? To from a very basic level, that's something that we struggle with. We tell them at least 3 different times that when they start work, their benefits will go away, and we continue to hear, oh, I didn't know that, you didn't tell me that, that would happen. And, some of it could be trauma related. Some of it could be we could be saying it in a different way. And I keep coming back to that, with the resources and the apprenticeships and all of the programs that could be available. Yeah, that's great. We could know about that. But if people aren't sort of retaining and processing that information in a certain way, they're not going to be like, yes, I want to do that, we're not going to be necessary if we're not seeing sort of that uptake of, yes, that people are saying themselves that they want to do that. We're not going to push because we don't know why they're not taking it up. Maybe it's there's a reason that they're not taking it up, and not to mention, we're not going to be there to push them at every other step of the process. So I think that there is a huge and rich conversation to be having here. What is the solution from all of our points of view? And I think one thing that I keep thinking about too is that we're required by PRM to be doing programming, to be collecting feedback from the clients, which is great. We are not experts at collecting that information, and we're also not experts at you know, figuring out how to change our programs to become better. So I think that there is a great opportunity between the resettlement agencies and research institutions to work together on that specifically. Collecting the information of what could be better from clients, and then that next step, which seems to be the huge barrier, the next step of like, okay, how could we be doing this better? And that's the question that we almost never have answered by people.
I might just add real quickly, because this came up several times in our research, which you'll see in the presentation if you look at the PowerPoint later, which is that, just like you're saying, Becca, and you know it a lot better than I do working with it every day, but these timing issues come up quite a bit, that people are saying, we have to get a job, you know, we feel like we're getting pushed to start working right away. And then, you know, within 5 years, we feel like we've gotten nowhere, and we're expected to have a good job within 5 years. And, you know, some people saying basically, we need to just be able to focus on surviving in that initial stage and learning English if we need to, and things like that. And the work stuff there needs to be more time where we don't have to worry about working yet. But that's, you know, how do you make that happen? But that seems to be like when people are sharing the IRBs are sharing the things that they wish were better. It seems like it's a lot of those things, the timing, because then they feel like they're cut off too quick from that hand-holding stage too, or that part where they get that intense. This is not news to you, but maybe there's some ways to work on that timing. I don't know, but that does seem to be a really important factor from what we've heard too.
Yeah, I was going to say that too. You know, we talk about in the tech college system, we talk about just-in-time support a lot. Just-in-time being, if you give a student, no matter what their background is or what their experience is, you give a student all of this information at once, it's going to be really overwhelming and tough for them to pick out the specific pieces that might be exactly appropriate for them. But if you have a conversation, and to your point, Paul, a relationship with that person where you're talking more generally, and then you can just in time provide them with a next step, a resource that provides a next step, the likelihood that that person will be able to use that resource is so much higher, because it's not muddled in this larger world of all these possibilities and resources that's just overwhelming. So I think about that with regards to what you just said, and with what Becca said earlier about how do we think about folks retaining this information. And again, Becca, you probably know this better than anyone, but just arriving, or maybe Samina, you too, just arriving, and how much information do you have to know? Do you have to wrap your head around? Is something like, I can get a GED or an HSED for free, like, is that at the top of your list of things that you're retaining in that moment? Maybe not. So how do we continue messaging in the right time so that people can use the resources that we have available?
Yeah, Colleen, your comments also led me to think maybe something to remember here, and Becca really brought this perspective to light for me, is also to remember kind of what directives are coming down from the federal level even. So there are some things we really can't resist here. And this is also going off of one of the comments we just had, which we need to maybe attend to, but there is a real fear that if these refugees are not quickly employed, if we don't quickly get them somewhere stabilized, there's going to be some sort of disorder. There's going to be they're going to turn to delinquency or even crime. That's a very much, I think, a concern coming from like public authorities. It's maybe not such a pleasant thing to talk about, but I think we need to keep in mind maybe priorities of the government and their concerns about social order. And so that's something that's really shaping a lot of the pressure that I think a lot of the resettlement agencies are under as well to quickly employ them.
So, well, this has been a really wonderful opportunity. Thank you, Colleen and Becca, for moderating this. Thank you, Paul and Kenneth and Samina are still here, but your whole team was a great asset, and just really appreciate this opportunity and this interaction. And I hope you guys will consider coming to some of our. We'll be revisiting some of these issues in our subsequent webinars in different ways. So just wanted to thank everyone for participating, and it was great that we got to go over and kind of get deeper into these issues, which I think is really rewarding for us. So maybe we can conclude by turning off the recording. Not sure how to